And before you begin, I've always been asked by both sides, I meant to do this earlier, the time clock. Presentation of the evidence, the House, 9 hours, 19 minutes and 12 seconds left. 9, 19 and 12 seconds. Respondent, 12 hours, 14 minutes and 15 seconds left. 12 hours, 14 minutes and 15 seconds. You may begin.
Good morning. Fine. Is your microphone on, please, sir?
Can you hear me? Is that better?
That's better.
Okay, good morning.
All right, Mr. Kamak, obviously, but state your name for the record, please.
My name is Brandon Raymond Kamak.
And Mr. Kamak, how old are you?
37, sir.
And as we've gone through this, you're doing really well about leaning forward. The microphone, I think that microphone and this one requires to be pretty close. If you, I sometimes may call it to your attention, but if you can just sort of try to keep it in mind, that would be good.
Okay.
Now, what's your profession?
I'm a lawyer.
And can you take about a minute and a half, if you don't mind, and sort of give us a little bit of your background and experience, whatever got you to where you are now?
Sure. It all started I went to school at University of Houston for my undergrad. I went to University of Houston law school as well. Graduated in 2015. During my time at U of H, I interned for the Public Defender's Office in Harris County. I clerked for the 208th District Court in Harris County for Judge Denise Collins. When I graduated, I went out. My dad, Sam Kamak, is also a criminal defense lawyer. I got out and started working for him. I worked for him for about 3 years, and then went off on my own, and I've been on my own, I guess, for the last 5 years now. And then about last year or so, I partnered with Ben Friedman, who's my business partner. We have a criminal and a personal injury docket. I think I've personally, at this point in my career, handled close to 600 cases, probably tried 15 to 20 cases, somewhere in there. Handled appeals up at the Court of Appeals in Houston. I've argued at the Court of Criminal Appeals, and that's what I do. That's how I got here.
All right, fine. When you say you graduated from law school 2015, and I believe you said you're 37?
That's correct.
So did you do something in between undergraduate and law school?
No, I didn't, sir. I just went straight into law school.
Okay. So when you graduated from law school 2015, you were what age?
It's 29.
All right. So I'm still trying to fit back. Ordinarily, you'd be 25 if you went straight for college. Did you do something before college or so?
I went to school for 2 years, and then I started working for my grandfather, Sam Kamak Sr., Sam Kamak II, for his business. And then I just took a few years off, just focused on working and making a living, and then decided to go back to school at my dad's advice.
Got you. So your grandfather was in what kind of business?
He was a business owner. He did a variety of things throughout his life, but he was a commercial real estate developer and also owned a mortgage business. And so I worked with him over there.
How long did you work for him?
I was there, I'd say, 2 to 3 years or so, and then decided to go back to school.
All right, now, as you're aware, the time frame we generally hear about are events in the year 2020. At that time, how long had you been a lawyer?
About 5 years.
Okay. And by the way, I think congratulations are due. Did you just recently get married?
I got married to my beautiful wife, Terry, on September 2nd,
So you have been married now how long?
A week and a half. We didn't get to do a honeymoon.
And is your wedding one thing that sort of set the time frame as to when you might be available as a witness in this case?
Yes, sir. That's why we didn't. I'm here, so we didn't get the honeymoon. We'll do that next year.
All right. Now, at the time that, let's say in the period of time of August of 2020, you'd been a lawyer about 5 years, is that right?
Yes, sir. That's correct.
Had you had any federal practice at that time?
I believe at that time I was licensed in the Southern District, but my practice was primarily in the county and district court, state court cases.
And was it at that time exclusively criminal?
Yes, sir. Exclusively criminal.
And you've added sort of a personal injury component to it since 2020?
That's correct.
All right. And in your criminal practice, had you ever been a prosecutor?
No, sir.
So had your experience been literally, exclusively, as you have described, doing criminal defense work?
That's correct.
So if you hadn't been a prosecutor, is it fair to assume that maybe you had never dealt with issuing grand jury subpoenas or dealing with a grand jury in the role of a prosecutor?
I had never issued grand jury subpoenas as a defense lawyer.
Okay. Now, you probably had prepared packets representing people for a grand jury, urging them that whatever your client's position was, correct?
Yes, sir. We've presented grand jury packets to the grand jury through the DA's office when we turn those over.
All right. Now, at the time, can you tell us when you first got involved in this case now? When did you first hear from someone, and whom was it?
Well, it would actually be on my birthday of 2020, August 22nd. That's when I first knew about Mr. Paxton reaching out to me. I got a call from an unknown number on that day. I think I was out to lunch with some friends or something. And then later that evening, I got a call from a gentleman named Michael Wynn, who I knew through the Rotary Club, and said that Mr. Paxton had reached out to me.
Excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt on you. Mr. Wynn, was Mr. Wynn already a friend of yours or an acquaintance? Would you describe, as of August of 2020, how would you describe your relationship with Mr. Wynn?
Just an acquaintance. I knew Michael. I've been heavily involved in the Rotary Club, which is a charitable organization. We have a downtown Rotary Club of Houston. I've been involved with charities for like the last 6 years, I think, and he became a member of that year. And then I had worked with Michael. He was a chair of the Houston Bar Association. I was a member, and he had reached out to me, I think, earlier this summer to do a panel on how the courts would conduct business during COVID-19. And so I reached out to Judge Rosenthal, Judge Susan Brown, Kelly Johnson, Judge Jordan, Herb Ritchie, and there was a gentleman from Baker Botts. But we basically did a Zoom panel on how we would conduct business. So that was my only interaction with Mr. Wynn.
All right. Did you become, as you got to know him, did you become familiar with the fact that he was a former federal prosecutor?
Yes, sir, I did.
And what was your knowledge as to his background at the time of this call that you just described that you got from him?
Well, at that time, I didn't really know much about his background, other than just, it was more just like when I would see him in passing, or at a Rotary meeting, how you doing? I didn't really, it wasn't like a friendship or anything like that. I just knew him from those two settings.
Now, you mentioned your father a while ago was and is a lawyer, but at the time that Mr. Wynn and ultimately the Attorney General reached out to you, were you in a solo practice or were you with your father?
I was in a solo practice at the time.
And did you have a secretary or anybody, or paralegal or anybody helping you?
I had a legal assistant, and I think at that time I maybe had one other lawyer working for me, and my older brother was in law school as well, and I sponsored his bar card as a temporary bar card or something like that.
All right, so that if you got involved into a case that involved potentially a great number of documents, witnesses, et cetera, the support you would have had would have been what?
I don't understand the question.
The support groups, I mean, what kind of legal support would you have had in order to be able to conduct an investigation or something?
Well, the documents that I received just personally to my email.
Okay. Now, tell me the nature of your call from Mr. Wynn.
Mr. Wynn had reached out to me and told me that Mr. Paxton was trying to get in touch with me. Didn't really say anything more than that. The call that I had gotten on my birthday from Mr. Paxton was from an unknown number, so there was really no way to call back. And then it wasn't until the next day that I spoke with him.
And so as a date for the jury to have, the date that you spoke with Mr. Paxton was what date?
That would have been August 23rd of 2020.
And by the way, up there, did you have with you, not that you did, but you have the invoice you ultimately sent to the Attorney General's office?
No, sir.
Did you bring it to the stand with you?
No, sir. I don't have anything in front of me.
Do you want or need that as a point of reference for dates? Or if you don't, that's fine. Or would you like to have available a copy in order to periodically check things? It's totally up to you.
I'll take it, sure.
Pardon me?
I'll take it, yes,
okay.
sir.
Mr. Hardin, this is his bill.
This is Exhibit 227, which I move to introduce if it is not in evidence.
No objection.
Admit Exhibit 227 into evidence.
Now, I'm not going to really regularly be talking to you about this necessarily, but I'm offering it to you as periodically if it helps you plug in some dates.
Okay.
Have you, in our conversations previously, have you sometimes referred to this to make sure you were comfortable with certain dates?
Yes, sir. With respect to the dates, this would be helpful for me to remember.
Right. Now, let's go to the first. By the way, did you learn as you went along, thank you, Stella, that Mr. Wynn was the one who recommended you to the Attorney General?
Yes, sir. Mr. Paxton told me that when I met him.
All right. So now let's go to that conversation, your first conversation with the then Attorney General, Mr. Paxton. Did you return his call or did he call you?
I believe I returned his call. I returned his call the next day, and we spoke. And he asked me to. He said he would. He had gotten my name from Michael Wynn. I think the words were, my name was dropped in the hat by Michael Wynn, and I'm looking to hire someone to work on a criminal investigation. And we scheduled a time for me to come out to Austin here to his office.
So, 5-year lawyer, solo practice. What was your reaction?
I mean, I was excited because it was the Attorney General's office, and so I was excited for the opportunity to go out and meet him.
All right. And did you do so?
I did.
And when did you do it?
I believe that was August 26th. Our meeting was on August 26th.
All right. And in the August 26th meeting, hold on just a second. All right, so tell me about that. Did you drive up to Austin or up to here?
Yes, sir. I drove out to Austin.
Did you go anywhere else first?
No, sir. Just came straight to meet.
Straight to the Attorney General's office?
That's correct.
All right. Describe for us that meeting.
So I went in, I signed in the front desk, and then I went up to the floor where his office is, and I think I waited around maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then Mr. Paxton came to the floor, and we went into his office, and then...
All right. Who was in the initial meeting between you and Mr. Paxton?
It was just me and Mr. Paxton in his office.
Do you recall about what time of day you talked to him?
I think that would have been... I don't recall the exact time, but maybe around lunchtime, somewhere in there.
Okay. Now, what did Mr. Paxton say?
So before I got there, he had actually reached out to me through text messages and said, "Can you bring a resume with you?" And I was like, "Well, I haven't prepared a resume in a long time," but I went ahead and prepared one, and I brought my resume in, and then it was kind of like, our conversation that we're having now. Where are you from? What do you do? Your background. I gave him my resume and just kind of pleasantries. And then he said that he was looking to hire a special prosecutor to investigate a criminal case where potentially there were potential violations of the Texas Penal Code.
And you mentioned special prosecutor. Was that his word?
Yes, sir.
And so, of course, you hadn't been hired at that time, but later when you were, whenever you represented yourself as a special prosecutor, where did that term come from?
Mr. Paxton.
All right. And did he tell you what the role of this special prosecutor he was interviewing you for would be?
No, sir. Not really.
Initially, when he talked about this job, what did you think it was going to entail?
My understanding, this was just an assumption. I was like, well, if I'm going to be hired as a special prosecutor, I would potentially be presenting a case to a jury maybe at some point, or presenting the case to be charged. That was my initial impression.
And he didn't tell you otherwise at that time?
That was, like I said, sir, that was just my assumption of what the job would entail.
All right. And then how long would you estimate you talked to him in this initial meeting in his office?
Roughly 15 or 20 minutes.
Did he express anything, any views about his own staff or why he was hiring somebody from outside?
Yes, sir. He said that he was interviewing multiple people, considering multiple people for the position, and that he couldn't get his own staff would not work on what he wanted them to work on.
All right. They said they would not work on it?
That's correct. And he mentioned that, he just wanted to find out the truth and about what happened.
Okay. Do you recall anything else from the conversation in that initial meeting?
No, sir. I mean,
Right. And then what happened after you had this original meeting with him in his office by himself?
He said, I want to introduce you to someone. I obviously knew who Mr. Paxton was. And he said, I want to introduce you to this first assistant, Jeff Mateer, whose office was down the hall. So he walked me over there, and I met with Mr. Mateer in his office, just Mr. Mateer and I.
And now, how would you characterize or describe Mr. Mateer's reaction when he came in and introduced you?
It was the same type of conversation, pleasantries, how are you? I gave him my resume. I told him, the conversation kind of didn't really get off the ground much. Just like, I'm here for the special prosecutor, interviewed for the special prosecutor position. And his attitude was kind of like disengaged about it. Knew about it, but didn't really seem interested in it. I'd say, kind of just like it was Mr. Paxton's own deal that he was focused on. It wasn't obviously wasn't an area of focus or concern for Mr. Mateer.
Did it strike you in any way as if his attitude was, so this is Mr. Paxton's deal, he's not that interested in it?
Sustained.
Thank you.
Then you tell me how it did strike you.
I'm sorry, sir.
How did it strike you as to Mr. Mateer's involvement in it?
Just he was very disengaged did not seem interested in it at all. Seemed like it was just kind of a side deal that Mr. Paxton was working on. It was his own focus. Mr. Mateer was not focused on it at all.
How long would you think you were in Mr. Mateer's office?
Say roughly 20 minutes.
Had Mr. Paxton left you there by yourself with Mr. Mateer?
Yes, sir.
And then what happened after you finished meeting Mr. Mateer?
I went back over to Mr. Paxton's office, and he was in there, just him and I. And I said goodbye. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for calling me out. And he said, okay, we might be in touch with you. So I drove back to Houston.
All right. So how was it left when this was all over in that first meeting?
I'm sorry, how was it left?
How was it left? What was supposed to happen next?
Well, I really didn't know. I mean, I looked at it like, okay, I just interviewed with Mr. Paxton and the first assistant, and so if they want to talk to me, they know how to get in touch with me. All
right. So you left, obviously. What's the next thing that happened in connection with this case?
I got a text message from a gentleman named Mr. Vassar a couple days later, asking me to set up a time to meet with him.
Do you recall the date or so that you got the text message?
That would have been August 26th or 7th, I believe. It was August 28th, maybe. 27th, 28th.
I'm looking down at Exhibit 227, and I notice it looks like the first time you charged was 9/3. So did you choose not to build the state for that first meeting or two when you went up there?
That's correct. And also I'd like to say that's a typo, that 9/3/20 date. The date that I actually went out there for the meeting was 9/4/20. So I made a typo there.
Okay, all right. Now, at the end, once you got back, you got the text from Mr. Vassar. What happened next?
So we scheduled a time to speak on the phone that day. That's what the text message was about. And we got on a call together.
All right. And did you ultimately send a draft or receive a contract or proposed contract from Mr. Vassar?
Yes, sir. He asked me for my email address on that phone call. And, I told him, this is about the special prosecutor position. And he agreed. And then he said, well, I need your email address. I'm going to be working on a contract for you.
Okay. Did you receive that contract?
So, yes, sir, I did.
When?
Well, I got the contract on 9/3, September 3rd, but I didn't. It must have got lost. I get hundreds of emails. It just got lost in the shuffle somewhere. So Mr. Paxton actually reached out to me on 9/3 and said, did you get the contract by text message? And I said no, because I was supposed to go out there on 9/4 to meet with the complainant, Mr. Paul, and also Mr. Paxton. So short answer is I got the contract. I just didn't see it that day. It got lost in the shuffle somewhere.
All right. So tell me about how this appointment or arrangement set up for 9/4. Whose idea was that?
So I got I got a call from Mr. Paxton, and it was kind of like, hey, we want you to do this job. And
excuse me for interrupting. Did you consider that the notice to you that you've now been hired?
yes, because he said I would be getting a contract, you got the job, and then he asked me, what's the hourly rate that you would charge to do this? And I said, well, I'll do it for $300 an hour. And he said, I think we can get that for you. And,
now, I'm just guessing, you correct me if I'm wrong. In your criminal practice, customarily your billing, were you charging people hourly ordinarily, or was it usually some type of flat fee arrangement?
on criminal cases, flat fee. On personal injury cases, contingency fee.
So did you have experience in charging that fee of $300 an hour, or were you just sort of guessing?
Well, I wasn't guessing. I just was trying to consider, what was going to need to be done in the case. I mean,
Okay.
And so I landed on 300. I thought that was fair.
All right. Now, when you had that, how long did that phone call that you're describing, was that your second call with Mr. Paxton?
Yes, sir.
All right. And then how long did that call last?
I don't recall. It wasn't very long. A few minutes, maybe.
You gave him your hourly rate, and then was there an appointment made for when?
So there was an appointment made on for 9/4, September 4th, 2020.
Who picked that date?
We agreed to that date because I was going to meet the complainant, or Mr. Paul, that morning. And so after, I'm in Houston, so I'm driving back and forth. I try to meet them both the same day. So
when did you receive Mr. Paul's name as the person that you were going to be, that you say complainant? In other words, describe what you meant by that when you said he was a complainant.
Well, he was the one who had made the complaint or the allegations, and so I viewed him as the complainant.
All right. Had you seen any document as yet connected with the case?
No, sir.
And so do you recall when you first received Mr. Paul's name?
That would have been from Michael Wynn when I set the meeting up to go out there and visit with him, with Mr. Wynn for the first time, Mr. Paul for the first time.
All right. Who set up the meeting with Mr. Paul?
Mr. Wynn.
And did you inform the Attorney General that you were going to also meet Mr. Paul before you met him on the 4th?
I did.
When did you do that?
I don't recall. It was within one of those days.
Would it have been the day that you talked to him about coming up on the 4th?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So did you inform him you were going first to Mr. Paul and then coming to the Attorney General?
That's correct.
So tell us about your first meeting with Mr. Paul. How did that happen and where?
So I met Mr. Paul at his office with Michael Wynn, and I drove out here early in the morning. I met with him for, I'd say, hour and a half, 2 hours, and that was the initial time that I, had heard the allegations about their complaint.
Had you done any research on Mr. Paul, his background, who he was, et cetera, before you had this first meeting with him?
I think I may have Googled his name and read a headline or something like that.
But did you limit your looking into him to Google him? Is that about the only thing you remember doing at that stage?
Yes, I didn't look at any court records or anything. I mean, that's all that I did.
And what was your level of knowledge about him when you first went to meet him on the
That he's
4th?
A commercial real estate developer here in Austin.
Okay. Did you see that he had a search warrant executed on his house and business back in August?
No, sir.
So what was your level of knowledge of Mr. Paul at the time you met him that first time, whether you got it from the Attorney General or anyone else?
I mean, I didn't know him, didn't know anything about him.
Okay. And where did you meet him?
At his office.
Who was present during the meeting?
It was Mr. Paul and Mr. Wynn.
All right. So what happened at the meeting, without going in necessarily at this time with what he said to you, what was the nature of the bill? Who did most of the talking in the meeting?
Nate Paul did most of the talking, and it was just a lot of information given to me in a short time period.
Well, how was he doing that? I mean, how were you given
He was talking,
Pardon?
he was just talking, trying to tell me, the circumstances surrounding the search of his home.
Did he make any presentation to you?
Towards the end, he showed me a copy of a search warrant and an order, and that was kind of the gist of his complaint. He showed me this presentation on a PDF document.
And so if you had to estimate the time that you visited with Mr. Paul at that time to get his, whatever he wanted to impart to you, how much of that hour and a half or hour and 45 meeting was Mr. Paul talking to you?
I don't understand, like a percentage type thing.
Yes.
Let's just say he was talking the majority of the time. Mr. Wynn was not.
And what was your first impression of Mr. Paul? How would you describe what you saw or listened to in this meeting?
Energetic, passionate, and had a lot of conviction, kind of an aggressive attitude, just a very, energetic person.
And what was your reaction when you left? Let me ask you this. Did he basically give you his side of the matter that you had been retained to investigate?
That's correct.
And what was your reaction to it?
I mean, I was convinced by what I was shown in the search warrant presentation and all that.
So when you left, to go talk to the Attorney General, what was had you already formed a personal belief as to what you thought was going on here?
No, not a personal belief. I was just like, hey, if what he's showing me on how the search warrant was altered is true, this is a big deal.
Okay. And did you, at that time, say to anybody or think that it looks like they did some bad stuff?
I had not developed an opinion about one way or the other. I mean, that was my first time, It's kind of like drinking through a fire hose, just a ton of information coming in a short time. And when I went to Mr. Paxton's office after that, I told him it was convincing, and he agreed.
Okay. So let's move now to General Paxton, meeting with General Paxton on the 4th of September, was it?
That's correct.
How long was that meeting? Where'd you meet him?
So we arranged to meet at his office again, and the meeting was, I think, roughly 20 minutes or so.
And then what did Mr. Paxton say in that meeting?
So I told him I was convinced, it was a convincing presentation of what he agreed with that. He also said that the people in his office who were not, they weren't investigating the case, they weren't working on it. At that point, I had learned that there were some federal agents and people, I guess, in positions of power who were kind of involved in that. And, he made a comment that you need to have some guts to work on a case like this. And I was fired up about the opportunity to do it.
Yeah. So how would you describe to the jury and the court your level now of excitement? Now that you've got a little bit of idea of what Mr. Paul says, you and the Attorney General have agreed is convincing, and you think this is going to be a big deal. What was your state of mind about that?
I was excited to be working on a project with the Attorney General's office.
You were already there, right?
I mean, it's the chief law enforcement officer of our state, and it wasn't about money or anything like that. It was just an opportunity to do something new in my career and try to help out.
All right. And when he said that you as people weren't working on you, did he express anything about how he felt about that to you, or tell you whether they were not working on it or they wouldn't work on it? In your own words, what did he say?
I don't recall specifically, but he said that he couldn't get the people in his office to work on this case.
Okay. And did you leave that meeting with the impression or feeling that his people were refusing to work on it?
Yes.
Did you wonder, well, if they're not going to work on it, why don't you fire them?
I mean,
You didn't think about that?
No, sir.
All right. Okay. Now, after that, did that meeting get terminated a little early, or tell me? You said it was about 20 minutes.
So he said
excuse me just a second. You've driven all the way up for Houston for it. What happened to shorten it a little bit?
He had to go to a press conference, and I was going to take off, and he said, well, why don't you just come over there with me to the press conference? And so I went over there with him and with one of his staff. came over to the press conference, and then after that, we went back to the office. I just kind of watched the press conference.
All right, so now, not only have you been hired by the Attorney General, but you're going to a press conference with him. How'd that make you feel?
Well, I mean, I've been with my dad in press conferences before in some of his high-profile cases, but it was cool.
Yeah, okay. All right, now, did you think anything about, well, let me back up. So you had 20 minutes or so to talk to him about the case. Did y'all talk about any of the facts in the meeting before the press conference?
No, I did not really have a full grasp on all of the people that were involved and all the facts of the case at that point. It was just...
Now, what was your impression or belief at that time as to the occupations or nature of the people you were supposed to investigate?
I knew that they were both local law enforcement, and some of them were federal law enforcement officers at the time.
Did you know that one of his allegations was about a federal magistrate?
Yes, sir.
What was your reaction to hear he wanted you to investigate a federal judge?
My reaction to it was just hearing out their side of the story. I didn't really have an opinion one way or the other. However, if the allegations that they were making were true, then that'd be serious.
Okay. Now, did you talk about any in that conversation, any of either Mr. Paul or him, of any people other than federal and local law enforcement being the people he wanted investigated?
No, sir.
After the press conference, how much longer were you in the company of the Attorney General?
I think probably 15 or 20 minutes. We went back to his office and finished up the conversation there.
Well, what happened in that conversation?
When we got back to the office, I was a little bit concerned because at the time I'm in private practice, I think I had roughly 75 cases on my own docket, and I told him, I'm like, well, if I'm coming back and forth between Houston and Austin, how am I going to be able to do this? And he said, well, look, his words were, if you can just get a wet ink copy of the original search warrant, this will be over pretty quickly. And I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, just if what had been produced to Nate Paul and his lawyers matched up with the original copy, it would be over quickly. But obviously, if there were discrepancies between the original wet ink copy and his words, then this thing could drag out a little bit more.
So what did you think you were going to do originally then? And by the way, had you ever heard the phrase, and maybe it's very common, I had a wet copy. Is that what he said, a wet copy?
A wet ink copy.
What does that mean? What did you take it to mean?
Just the original search warrants that was signed off by the judge had, a wet ink signature on it.
Okay.
Not the scanned PDF version.
All right. So what did you walk out of that meeting heading back in the car to Houston? Did you think your mission was?
So we really didn't go into the scope of the work. At that point, it wasn't until I actually got so the copy of the contract had been sitting in my inbox. So when I get back home and I read my contract and see that the scope is limited to like more of an investigative role, then I'm like, okay, well, I'm a lawyer. I'm just going to collect evidence, review evidence that's presented to me, and draw some type of conclusion to either corroborate what the allegation is or contradict that, and put it in a brief and submit it. So I knew at that point, once I read my contract, that I wouldn't be trying a case or anything like that. It was limited in scope.
Can you put the original the contract up and go to the addendum A, please? I believe the contract is in evidence in several ways.
Is this in, Mr. Hardin? Do you know?
Pardon me?
Is it in?
I think it is.
I'm not
I'll
contradicting. I
check.
just
Hold
don't
on
know.
just a sec.
Could we get an exhibit number, Rusty? his exhibit.
It is in.
It's House 160 and it's in evidence.
Thank you.
Now, do you recognize this particular excerpt from the contract?
Yes, sir.
All right. And if you could scroll up just, yeah, that's going to be good. Can you explain to the jury what you realized your scope was more limited when you saw this, I take it you're saying, than you originally imagined your role would be?
Just in an investigative role, and then my ultimate goal or job at the end of this would be to prepare a report of my findings and give that to the Attorney General's office, and whatever they do with it is.
And was this scope different than what you understood it to be when you originally talked to the Attorney General?
This was different than what I had, I guess, come up with in my mind, what I would be doing.
Can you tell us what lines or sentences there, Mr. Kamek, so she can highlight exactly what you noticed when you saw that it was a little bit changing the scope of what you could do?
Can I have a second or just look at this and read it?
So, for instance, do you see the sentence, if you would, and shall prepare a report documenting any potential criminal charges that may be discovered in the course of the investigation? Do you see that? And before.
So that's yes, sir. That's the report I was referring to.
Okay. And that is a more restricted role, is it your testimony? That's really a more restricted role than you understood from the Attorney General you were originally going to have.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Is that a more restricted role than you originally thought you were going to have when you talked to the Attorney General?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, you notice it says, notwithstanding anything to the contrary contained in this outside counsel contract, outside counsel shall conduct this investigation only as consistent with the complaint referred to the OAG and is only as directed by the OAG. Correct? So who did you believe you were being hired by?
The Office of the Attorney General.
Had you had any contact with the District Attorney's Office?
No, sir.
Did you ever at any time during this representation think you were working for the District Attorney's Office?
No, sir.
Throughout your representation in this matter, whom did you think, or who hired you, and whom did you think you were working for?
The Office of the Attorney General.
All right. And in turn, throughout all of this, who in the Attorney General's office in a position of responsibility did you consistently have your contact with?
The only person I reported to was Mr. Paxton at his direction.
Okay. Now, you see, except for outside counsel's duty to provide a post-investigation report, this outside counsel contract expressly excludes legal services relating to any other post-investigation activities, including, but not limited to, indictment and prosecution. Had you yourself looked into the law that talked about the respective jurisdictions of a district attorney's office and the Attorney General's office?
No, sir.
Did you ever?
No, sir.
Okay. In this particular matter, what event did you think you were going to be investigating?
The referral from Travis County DA's office with respect to this allegedly unlawful search.
All right. And then later, did you receive another referral, what's been called referral number 2?
Yes, sir.
Now, that's dated September the 23rd. Do you happen to recall when you received it?
I think I got that on 9/24.
Okay.
On an email from the Travis County DA's office.
And was that a totally different matter than you were originally hired to investigate?
Yes, sir.
When you got that, what was your response?
Well, I read through it, and I don't remember when I spoke with Mr. Paul and Mr. Wynn at the meeting, if it was before or after that, but when I got it, it was related to some type of alleged mortgage fraud where these lenders were wrongfully foreclosing on his properties and then trying to sell it at the auction. I don't recall any more detail than that.
All right. And when you looked at that one, of course, who was the complainant, the person who was complaining about the criminal conduct and wanted it investigated?
It was also Nate Paul.
Now, when you looked at it, did you see that it was essentially a complaint about civil litigation matters?
Are you at, I'm sorry, could you?
Yeah, and I'm really only asking about your mindset.
Yes, sir.
Not one way the other.
Okay.
Did you notice whether it actually was a complaint about civil litigation matters in bankruptcy court?
Well, I wasn't looking at it through that lens at all. And to be frank with you, I didn't have any experience in handling any type of mortgage fraud or prosecuting any type of potential white-collar crime in that way.
All right. So did you just sort of put it aside and not ultimately do anything with it?
No, sir. That's not true.
Okay. Well, tell me in your words.
Well, I spoke with Mr. Paxton about the referral because I wasn't sure if my scope of my contract covered that.
Certainly.
And so, you know, he said that it did. And so I was like, well, I'm going to rise to the occasion. I'm going to figure this out.
All right. So let me see if we can go through the mindset or experience for you here. You see a referral on a separate matter, which is not the one you were originally hired for, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you receive it on September 24th, and you notice it's an allegation of mortgage fraud occurred in bankruptcy court. You see that?
Yes, sir.
So how did you find out what the Attorney General felt about it? Did you call him?
Yes, sir. I mean, I'm sorry, but I don't remember the exact date.
That's okay.
But I asked him, I know for sure that I asked him if that was covered within the scope of my contract, and he said yes.
Do you remember when that conversation was and what the rest of the conversation was?
I would just have to give you an approximation. It was roughly around the time that I received the contract on 9/24, either a day before or a day after, or the day of, just somewhere in that 23 to 25th range.
And do you recall what the occasion of that conversation with him was, somewhere around the 24th of September? Did you call him explicitly for that, about whether this referral number 2 was in your contract, or were there other things that y'all talked about as well?
I don't recall the entire nature of that specific call.
Okay. Did you notice when you looked at referral 2 that one of the people he was asking to be criminally investigated was a federal bankruptcy judge named Tony Davis?
No, sir.
You didn't notice at that time?
No, sir.
Okay. Did that referral, just like the first referral, have a list of people that Mr. Paul claimed were people of interest?
It did, yes, sir.
All right. And did it list these people? Do you recall whether when it listed them, whether it listed actually personal data like their address and their phone numbers?
I don't recall if that was in the referral or not.
All right. Don't remember whether it was in referral number 2. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir.
All right. Was that the case in referral number 1?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
There were names and I believe some demographic information.
All right.
The first one. I don't recall.
Now, in referral number, I mean, let's go back now to the period a little before September 24th, when we were talking about the original referral. After you returned, did you receive any type of documents and materials to review when you left the meeting with both Mr. Paul and back on the 4th of September?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us what kind of materials he gave you that you took back to Houston to review?
So I had taken my handwritten notes from the meeting back with me. And then I also received like a little 5 or 6 page document that appeared to be some type of timeline of events giving Mr. Nate Paul's version about what happened.
All right. Now, did you take that just as his version?
Yes, sir.
All right. But when you left there, what did you have when you left there, and then on the 4th and after your meeting with the Attorney General, had you developed sort of a game plan in your own mind as to how you were going to do the investigation?
So I did. I was trying to consider, how to get information to either corroborate or contradict what was being said.
All right. And did you tell us how you viewed the role of Mr. Paul and his lawyer, Mr. Wynn, in this, in terms of what role were they to play in the upcoming investigation?
Well, I viewed Mr. Paul as the complainant. He's the one who was complaining of these allegations, and then, Mr. Wynn was his attorney in some other separate matter.
How did you view your role as the Attorney General? Did you look at them almost as a client in terms of them sharing information with you and all? How would you describe that in your own words? With who? Mr. Paul.
Okay.
And of course, Mr. Wynn's his lawyer. But in your view of did you consider yourself as like a prosecutor and a citizen had come in and made a complaint?
I viewed him as a complainant in the case, and just in the same way that if a client hires me for a case and they bring in a banker's box full of documents and information, I'm going to go through it. And so I didn't think that it was unusual that I would be getting information from the complainant and his attorney. And as I got that information, I thought this was the same information that Mr. Penley had.
Yes. Had you met Mr. Penley?
No, sir.
Did you ever meet him?
No, sir.
All right. So when you originally were hired by the Attorney General, did you make a certain assumption as to what your role in Mr. Penley's would be?
Well, I thought I would meet Mr. Penley at some point. I remember I asked Mr. Paxton in that first or that second meeting if I'd be meeting, am I going to talk to him? Does he have a file that I can start working with? And his response was, I think he was out of town, and he had a file on his desk. So I did assume at some point that I would meet Mr. Penley and take a look at his file.
Well, did you assume originally that you would be working with the Attorney General's staff as you gathered information, and that would mean that you'd be working with the division head?
I did. Obviously, as a solo practitioner, I don't have access to a lot of the resources that government offices has. And so I thought at some point I would be dealing with or meeting with some of these individuals.
Right. And so did you just assume that Mr. Penley was being kept informed as what was going on here?
I didn't really think about that at the time.
Okay, fair enough. But at any time, how many times did you ask Mr. Paxton about either meeting Mr. Penley or getting some information or getting some support from the Attorney General's office?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question, Mr. Harden. Can you repeat your question, Rusty? I didn't hear it. I'm sorry.
Sure. How many times did you ask Mr. Paxton about either meeting Mr. Penley or getting some information or getting some support from the Attorney General's office?
Thank you.
I asked, it's kind of two parts. With respect to Mr. Penley, I'd only talked to him about Mr. Penley maybe twice, and then that was early on, and then that's when I was asking about, was there a file, and how do I get in touch with him on this deal? And then as far as getting support from the office, I think I asked probably 4 or 5 times over the course of this 3.5-week period when this all happened, can I get badge, can I get credentials, which I never got, but I repeatedly asked for those things.
And what was the Attorney General's response each time?
I think initially his response is, okay, we'll have to get somebody to work on that, or we'll get it to you. It was just I never got a firm answer on when I would be getting those things. I knew I would need it when it came to issuing subpoenas and things like that.
Yeah, so what things were you asking him for? Let's start with Mr. Penley. Each time that you asked him or mentioned Mr. Penley, did he have some reason not to put you in touch with Mr. Penley?
The only thing that I asked about Mr. Penley was, did he have a file and will I be meeting with him? To which his response was, he's out of town and his file is on the desk. I just thought in my mind that I would eventually meet with him to discuss this case. I mean, I don't know anything about any of these people in that office, and so I'm like, I didn't know anything going on. So
How did you know Mr. Penley just looking at a flow chart? How'd you know about him?
I knew the name from Mr. Wynn and Mr. Paul in that first meeting.
Did Mr. Wynn and Mr. Paul, were they critical of Mr. Penley in that first meeting?
Yes.
What did they say?
Well, they said that Mr. Penley said that there was no information that could be presented to him that would make him believe that a federal official broke the law in the way that they claimed.
All right. And this conversation with them was that was the one September 4th?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, do you think that's a little strange that they didn't want to deal with the head of the division in the Attorney General's office?
My understanding was that they had met with him one time.
That's all, just one time?
Yes, sir. That's what I was told.
Is that what they told you?
Yes, sir. And he refused to look into it. And then that was kind of reinforced by the fact that Mr. Paxton said that he couldn't get anyone in his office to work on the case.
All right. So in your conversations with them and as your investigation, were you ever told or informed that they actually met with Mr. Paul 3 times?
Excuse me, Your Honor, that them, objection hearsay, that includes other people other than Mr. Paxton.
Sustained.
Let me ask you this. Did you ever learn from Mr. Paul, Mr. Wynn, or Attorney General Paxton that Mr. Penley...
Excuse me, same exact objection.
Let me just finish, please.
I'm sorry.
That Mr. Penley or Mr. David Maxwell met with Mr. Paul and Mr. Wynn 3 times.
Okay, that's both multifarious and hearsay.
Sustained.
Did you ever learn that Mr. Penley, did you learn anything from any source about how often Mr. Penley was trying to get Mr. Wynn to provide further documents?
Objection.
Objection is only was he aware of anything like that?
Objection hearsay. The question was, did you learn from any source? Objection hearsay.
I'm only...
Overruled.
Thank you. Were you?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question?
Sure. Were you ever aware from any source that Mr. Penley, after 3 meetings, was continuing to try to get documents from Mr. Wynn? Did you ever hear that from anybody?
Objection. I'm sorry. Objection hearsay. I apologize. Sorry, Mr. Kamick. Sorry, Rusty. Objection hearsay.
Sustained.
In your mind, what was your understanding from any source of the level of involvement of Mr. Penley and Mr. Maxwell in this investigation?
I'm sorry, Rusty, the level of?
I'm not asking for any statements or anything. I'm asking what his understanding of mindset was.
I understand. I just didn't. You said the level of, and then the word trailed off. I'm sorry if I'm being difficult.
How sorry are you?
Pretty sorry. Sorry enough.
All right. My question, I think, stands, Your Honor. I simply want to know what his state of mind and level of knowledge was, because it has a lot to do with what he does later.
Yeah, I didn't hear an objection, actually. I just heard him say...
I didn't either, so...
He just said he couldn't hear you. So.
I just didn't understand the question. That question, as asked, I'm fine. Go ahead.
Is your microphone on?
Well, he's reading it. I can't read that far.
Go
ahead. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Now, in at the end of the day, what was your level of knowledge about this?
So I was told early on by Mr. Paxton that the people in his office weren't doing what he asked them to do. That's why he was considering hiring outside counsel.
Right.
And then towards the end of September, in this 3.5-week period, I was told by Michael Wynn that Mr. Penley had reached out to him kind of out of the clear blue for documents. And then I asked Mr. Paxton about that when I spoke with him, and he said, well, I told him to stand down. He's not working on this case. You are.
That who should stand down?
Mr. Penley.
Yeah. General Paxton told you that Mr. Penley should stand down. He wasn't involved in the case anymore?
That's correct. And that was my only other time that I knew about any of his involvement.
All right. Do you recall when that conversation was and where you were?
It would have been a phone call towards the end of September.
All right. Thank you. Now, let's go back after the 4th. I assume you started reviewing the materials you had received?
Yes, sir.
Tell us about how you proceeded in your investigation then.
All right, so still trying to get my arms around what was alleged and all of the folks that were involved in it, and trying to figure out, since I didn't really have any information, what information I would be able to obtain. And just started kind of thinking of the way to do this would be to do grand jury subpoenas to get information regarding like phone calls and things between the individuals involved in that first referral.
All right. Now, by the way, did you during this period of time, Mr. Kamek, consult with any other people you thought might have had these types of investigations before to sort of get an idea how to proceed?
No, sir. No,
This
sir.
is not something you had done before, correct?
I had not ever done this before.
Okay. Now, by the way, in your communications with the Attorney General, how were you communicating with him? By phone, by text, by email? Can you describe the forms of communication y'all used?
So we spoke by phone and through text message, and then throughout this process, I continually forwarded emails to him as something would come up or I would get some information.
Well, did you use any kind of encrypted communications?
Yeah, I think about the middle of the month, he asked me to use the Signal app, which I wasn't really familiar with at the time. I just thought it was like a WhatsApp or just a messaging
You weren't
deal.
familiar with Signal app at that time?
I'd never used it before.
All right. And how did that come about that he wanted you to communicate with him using Signal app?
He asked me on a phone call to download the app and use that.
Did you go on the internet to look and see what a Signal app was?
No, sir, I just downloaded the app.
Okay. And do you recall what the nature of the conversation was in which he asked you to start using Signal app?
It would have been a call where we were talking just generally about the case, kind of the status of it and what was going on. It wasn't I do remember it was not a phone call specifically about using that app.
And what type of email address did you use with him?
But what do you mean?
Well, do you recall what the email address was?
No, sir.
Was it an official Attorney General's office email address?
Oh, I see what you mean. No, sir.
All right. What was it?
His email address was a Proton mail address.
All right.
That I was given.
Had you used Proton before?
No, sir.
Had you ever heard of Proton?
I had heard of it. I've never used it.
Okay. Now, in addition, what about the phones? What type of phone number did you have that you would communicate with him?
I had the original number that he had first called me on, and then I think later he gave me another number. Around that time, I was getting calls from unknown numbers, or it'd say potential spam. You know, you get those types of calls, and I was like, well, I don't want to miss the Attorney General's number, so I got myself a separate number and gave it to him. That way I knew when that phone rang, that was Mr. Paxton calling.
So are you saying that you ultimately got a phone that was totally dedicated to phone conversations with the Attorney General of the state of Texas, and that's the only number that you communicated with on that phone?
Yes, sir.
And you did that why?
Because I didn't want to miss a call from an unknown number or a spam likely call, or, when you get those spam calls, I didn't want to have that come up and miss an important call. So
Did he use multiple phone numbers with you?
yes, sir.
How many?
2 numbers.
Okay. And were either of those official Attorney General lines?
I believe they were cell phone numbers. I don't believe they were office numbers.
All right. In fact, when was the first time that you ever learned what the official email address or the Attorney General office email address was of the Attorney General that you were dealing with all this time?
The first time that I ever saw his governmental email address
Yes.
was when I got a cease and desist letter from Jeff Mateer.
And when was that?
That would have been, I believe, August 1st or 2nd.
And how was it that you saw what the Attorney General's official email address was?
They were all copied on the email. All the gentlemen, Mr. Vassar, I think, was one of them. And
Was that first time when you got your cease and desist letter, the first time you ever knew of any official communication form of communicating with the Attorney General, whether it was through text or email or phone?
I thought all of my communications with him were official, but that was the first time that I saw his governmental email address.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Now, did you trust the Attorney General?
Yes, sir.
Were you flattered about him reaching out to you?
Yes, sir.
Did you trust Michael Wynn?
Yes, sir.
Did you appreciate him referring you to the Attorney General?
I did. Yes, sir.
Okay. And did you always trust Michael Wynn to have your best interest at heart and try to help you?
Yes, sir. I didn't have any reason not to trust him. I knew that he was Nate Paul's lawyer.
Okay. Did you trust Nate Paul?
Didn't really know Nate Paul. Just was trying to do my job.
All right. Now let's move to the period of the middle of September. After you came back, you had all your material from the 4th that you'd gotten from Nate Paul. What did you do after that?
So around this time, I had a conversation with Mr. Paxton because I wanted to try to get the individuals named in that first referral, like call logs and email logs showing whether or not these people had been talking around the time that the search had taken place. And so, being that it's sensitive, since they are federal agents and there's some people in power there, I thought that the grand jury subpoena would be a discreet way to get that information. And so I brought that up to Mr. Paxton.
And do you recall when this conversation was?
I believe it was around, we had talked about it from early on in the month, like within that first week of September, but the conversations kind of continued going on until about the middle of the month, about September 14th.
Okay. Now, at that time, what did you say to Mr. Paxton, and what did he say to you?
I told him I think we should try to do a grand jury subpoenas, being that this is a discreet way to get information. Grand jury proceedings are private and secret proceedings, and so we'd be able to get information that way without raising any kind of alarms or causing some type of, panic about the situation. And he said it was a smart idea.
So he endorsed it?
Yes, sir.
Did either of you talk about the fact that if you issued grand jury subpoenas for a claimed offense that Mr. Paul was presenting to you, that the recipients of those grand jury subpoenas would know what was going on, or have questions, or be maybe even alarmed? Did y'all discuss that at all?
Excuse me, objection leading.
I think I gave him several choices.
Sustained.
Did y'all talk about the possible reaction of people that got these subpoenas?
No, sir.
Later you issued subpoenas, did you not, for credit unions and banks and stuff like that, correct?
Yes, sir.
Was there any conversation between you and the Attorney General about how those people might feel when they got those grand juries?
No, sir.
Did you become later aware, we'll get to who all that were on there, of that some of these subpoenas were going to lawyers or people that were opposing Mr. Paul in litigation? Were you aware that that's who some of the people were?
No, sir.
Okay, well then let's get to what you know. When you talk to the Attorney General back about downloading the app and everything, were you also talking to him at that time about trying to seek credentials and other types of things that you needed for what you were doing?
Yes, sir. I needed
When did you first start asking for those types of things?
in my first meeting with him on September 4th, and then I asked about it again, like as I'm approaching the time where I need to be, as the time I'm doing the applications for these subpoenas.
What did you ask him for?
Email address, am I going to get some type of badge or some credentials, like, because I'm going to be approaching people with legal documents, and I need something to show that I have the authority to do that.
But what did he say?
We're working on it.
Now, you assumed, did you not, that of course it'd be perfectly fine to give you those things because it would be a public record and there was nothing wrong with it, correct?
I expected to get that.
Yes. And you expected and believed you were going to need that, did you not, in your investigation?
Yes, and I ended up, I did need it.
How many times do you think you asked the Attorney General for these official documents?
It would have had been 4 or 5 times over the course of a month.
And each time you asked him for him, what was his response?
We're working on it. We'll get it to you.
At some time, did you begin to wonder why they would not give you any kind of official documents to show your status?
No. I don't know how the office operates within the Attorney General's office. I wasn't sure if there was a bunch of red tape to go through. I didn't know any of that. I just knew that I would need it to do what he was asking me to do.
Right. We always hear about the slowness of bureaucracy and government agencies. Is that the kind of thing you just thought was going on?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So it never occurred to you that maybe he didn't want them to be public?
Objection, leading and assuming facts not in evidence.
Sustained.
Did it ever occur to you? Did you ever have the thought, a wonder, don't they want this public or what? Did you have that kind of thought process?
I wasn't thinking about anything like that.
Fair enough. Now, when you mentioned the grand jury possibility to the Attorney General, in that conversation, and you think that conversation was when, roughly?
That would have been around, I know I spoke with him about it on September 6th, so I have a note here on this invoice, but the middle of the month around September 14th.
Okay.
There were a couple conversations where I was just kind of trying to figure my way through this.
Now, you, of course, as you mentioned before, had never done a grand jury investigation, correct?
That is correct.
So did you ask him some questions, to the Attorney General, some questions to try to help you in that respect? First of all, did you assume that maybe he would know these kind of answers?
Yes, sir. I am so sorry. Judge, is there any way I can use a restroom break?
We'll stand at ease for 10 minutes.
Sorry about that.
No. We'll give you 10 minutes. The witness may step down.
Thank you, Judge.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I would just stand at your desk, George. I would not leave. He's just stepping out and coming right back. Mr. Hardin, you may resume.
Thank you, Your Honor. All right, Mr. Kamek, I want to go to, if I may, when you were asking him and talking to him about the grand jury subpoenas. During that conversation, and you mentioned that you asked him about credentials, how did you go about trying to find out how to do a grand jury issuing and using grand jury subpoenas? What did you do? Your microphone.
Yes, sir. So I asked Mr. Paxton, at this point, he's like, that's a smart idea. This is the way that we should proceed. So the next question is, okay, well, how do we do this? Because I wasn't sure whether the Attorney General's office had their own special grand jury in session for cases, or if we would do it through county, like Travis County grand jury. And so I didn't know the answer to that. He said he didn't know the answer to that. He would need to find out. And, I think he had indicated to me at that time, he wasn't a criminal lawyer. Most of his experience was in business law. So he would find out which grand jury that we would.
And did you find out?
he reached back out to me around the middle of the month, maybe a day or so after, and told me that we would be going through the Travis County grand jury.
But the AG himself called you back and told you that?
Yes, sir.
And then what did you do?
So my next step was to reach out to Travis County District Attorney's Office, and it was kind of weird because before I even have an opportunity to do that, I get a message or a voicemail that Michael Wynn had sent me saying, this is the person that you need to contact over there.
How soon after you had the conversation with the Attorney General that concerning the fact that it would be a Travis County grand jury, how soon after that conversation with the Attorney General did Mr. Wynn reach out and give you a contact in the Travis County DA's office?
I don't recall exactly, probably within 24 to 48 hours.
Do you have any idea how Mr. Wynn would have known that you were seeking that information?
Well, I'm sorry.
Had you told Mr. Wynn you were trying to find out, or did it just come in unsolicited?
No, I spoke with Mr. Wynn about the grand jury process.
All right.
So he was aware, him and Nate Paul were both aware that that's how I was proceeding with their investigation.
When you got that information, did you reach out to the Travis County grand jury?
I reached out to the Travis County District Attorney's Office and spoke.
Excuse me. I said grand jury. You're right. The office. Excuse me. Go ahead.
I spoke with, I forget, it was a nice woman. I forget her name. She put me in touch with a gentleman named Don Clemmer. And then Don Clemmer put me in touch with, I guess, this real sweet lady. I think her name was Bailey. She might have been the grand jury coordinator over there.
Let me ask you this. Was it last name Mulder? Does that sound?
That sounds like
all right.
correct.
Did you tell these folks that you were a special prosecutor working with the Attorney General's office?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And as such, you were asking assistance to get some grand jury subpoenas?
Yes, sir.
And did they help you get the grand jury subpoenas?
Yes, sir, they did.
And let me ask you, at this time, Your Honor, I want to move to introduce en masse, I believe we informed counsel on the other side, Exhibit 257, which I'll represent as all of Mr. Kamak's production in this matter to both sides. These are the documents that he has produced to lawyers on both sides, and I move to introduce them in toto.
Any objection? Speak on the microphone, please. Still can't hear you.
Object to 649, 691.
Dan, can I stop you for just a second to explain to the court? We have given them excerpts. So that it was too voluminous to be carrying around the hard document here. But what we did do, about 2,000 pages, I think it was a lot. What we've then I've gone through and taken out excerpts and put an exhibit number on them. But they are excerpts from what I was seeking to do was introducing the whole group and then taking out and putting an exhibit number on those that we specifically were going to talk about. Go ahead.
I appreciate all that, Mr. President, but to be clear, we got an amended exhibit at 4:50 this morning, which includes these, several of which I will be objecting to, several of which I won't.
Excuse me, are we going to start getting into when we get stuff for them and what time of the morning? I would just ask for
Just stop right now.
Yeah.
You would, like I started to say, object to 649, 691, 687, 688, 689, 690, 686, and 650.
Reason for the objection?
Sir?
You objected to those documents, okay?
I am. Now,
Okay.
I do not have objections to 677, 678, 679, 680, 681, 682, 683, 684, 685, and 693. The last sequence, Mr. President, I do not have an objection to.
So let's go back to the objection.
Yes, sir.
I'd asked you for a reason for the objection to the
Yes, sir.
other documents.
Yes, sir. The basis is hearsay on each. And just so, let me try to get them in order so Mr. Hardin and I can literally be on the same page.
May I ask one more time real quickly the ones you object to, Dan?
Sure.
Make sure I got all of them.
Yes, sir. The ones I'm objecting to are in order, Rusty, are 649. That's the work product. If you're with me, you want me to come over there? I'm happy to do that if that's easier for you.
No, go ahead.
649, 650, 686, 687, 689, 690, and 691.
And the type of objection, Your Honor, the basis?
Hearsay. And I don't know if you, Judge, do you have, Mr. President, do you have them in front of you?
We don't have them.
May I do this? May I do this? Let me go right now to discuss the ones that has no objection to and ask that they be admitted.
Sure.
Okay, we'll admit the items that you have no objection to, and to be certain we have those right numbers, would you repeat those numbers that you do not object to?
The numbers that and I'm not sure these are in order, but 677, no
Yes.
objection.
Okay,
678, no
Yes.
objection. 680, 681, 682,
yes,
683,
yes,
684,
yes,
685,
yes.
and 693.
What about 679?
All right.
Hold on one second, just checking this.
You inquired on
what I-
679. I don't have that one in front of me.
Okay, you originally said you had no objection to 679, but you may have misspoken.
Certainly capable of doing that. No, 670. You're correct, Mr. President. 679. We do object to 679.
Okay, so 679. So to the court reporter, and forgive my for a moment there, something I said the witnesses shouldn't do. So to be clear to the court reporter, no objection to 677, 678, 680, 681, 682, 683, 684, 685, 693. And it's my understanding, Mr. Hardin, to begin, you will just focus on those. And if you want to refer to the others, you'll have to give us an answer on why it's not hearsay at that time.
That's correct. Your time, could I?
I'm admitting, so we are admitting into evidence 677, 678, 679, 680. I'm sorry, 677, 678, not 679 at this time. 680, 681, 682, 683, 684, 685, and 693.
Your Honor, can I have 10 minutes credit back because of the housekeeping we did here?
Did you say you needed 10 minutes?
Could I have 10 minutes credit back for the conversation we've
I'll
had?
give you 5.
Thank
All right.
All right. One has to take what they can get. All right. Mr. Kamek,
Yes, sir.
did you start receiving assistance to get these grand jury subpoenas done as to who they would be from Mr. Wynn?
Yes, sir.
And is it still on? I didn't hear. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. And what form of assistance were you getting from him?
Well, I started to get a lot of information from Mr. Paul and Mr. Wynn through emails. That included the list of individuals who were, I guess, suspects or somehow witnesses or somehow related to that first initial referral.
And were these people that were to be put on the list of subpoenas?
Some of them were, yes, sir.
All right. And were you receiving from Mr. Wynn regularly information of people to include on the grand jury subpoenas?
Yes, sir.
Now, what was your thought process in terms of your investigation as to why you would automatically put those people on if they're asking? In your mind, you were doing what?
Well, I didn't independently source any of these individuals' name. I walk into this referral, and I'm given a lot of information about different people who were involved and how they may be related to that first referral. And so I trusted that that was the information that that they were giving me was the same information that the Attorney General's office, Mr. Penley, would have already had to conduct his investigation.
All right, so you assumed that you were just getting information that already existed?
Yes, sir.
In the hands of the the AG?
Yes, sir.
But you hadn't talked to anyone in the AG, correct?
Other than Mr. Paxton, that's correct.
All right. And each time that you had a course of action in this case and thought you were going to do something, did you have a practice of contacting the Attorney General to update him?
Yes, sir.
And so as you went along and gathered all this information from Mr. Wynn and Mr. Paul, were you keeping the Attorney General informed of all this?
Yes, sir. I would discuss it on the phone, or anytime I got like a document emailed to me from Mr. Wynn, I would forward that on to the Attorney General's email address. And then when we spoke again, if we did, I would say, hey, I sent you this or sent you that.
So let me see if I understand. Whenever you received information from Mr. Wynn and or Mr. Paul by email, you would then forward that information to the Attorney General?
The majority of the time, yes, sir.
All right. So when they were sending you list of people that should be subpoenaed by the grand jury, were you making sure you kept Mr. Paxton informed of that?
I'm sorry, do you mean if like I sent that information to him, or just letting him know that I received that information, or?
Just letting him know that you received that information.
Yes, sir.
All right. So would it be an accurate statement that as you proceeded in this, well, let me put it another way. As you proceeded in your investigation, and as you determined what to do with the grand jury and what to do about grand jury subpoenas, were you at each stage keeping the Attorney General informed?
Yes, sir.
At any time, did the Attorney General contact you and say, no, let's don't do that?
No, sir.
So from your own state of mind, in every single thing you did in this investigation, what is your testimony to the jury as to whether you believed you had the full support and agreement of the Attorney General of the state of Texas?
That's true. I did everything at his supervision, kept him informed on everything. When I reached out to Travis County District Attorney's Office and introduced myself regarding the grand jury subpoenas, I got affirmation the entire time that everything was good, and no one said anything different until I, got a cease and desist letter at the end of.
And so it was one of your frustrations that you didn't have anything official to tell people that's what you were doing. Is that correct?
That's right.
Excuse me. Objection leading.
I'm sorry.
Well,
Sustained.
were you frustrated about the not having any identification and documents and means to tell others in this outside world?
Yes, because yes, sir.
All right. And what was the reason? What was the reason for being so frustrated?
For example, when I had some subpoenas issued for Microsoft, and I got an email back saying, without a governmental email address, we can't execute these subpoenas. So I knew that as I'm continuing to work in the course of this deal, that I would need to have some type of identification, whether it's a governmental email address, some number. I don't know what their processes are, but I knew that I would need some type of credential to be able to do what I was asked to do.
What were you subpoenaing Microsoft for?
email records, I believe, for certain individuals that were involved in that first referral.
All right. So in the first referral, you were seeking email information, everything from Microsoft about all of these individuals?
Whoever had like an Outlook email address.
And in addition to the people involved in the execution of the search warrant, were you receiving from Mr. Wynn other names that should be added in?
I don't recall all of the names that were on the list.
Oh, yeah, I'm not asking you what the names were, but were you receiving, during this time that you were conducting investigation, continued list and suggestions of people to investigate and to list a grand jury subpoena for?
Yes, sir.
And at this stage, did you reach a stage of discomfort that you were getting all this information from the lawyer of a man that you knew was already under investigation by law enforcement?
I didn't know that Mr. Paul was under investigation at the time. I knew about the search, obviously, but I didn't know that he was under any kind of, at the time, it would have been a current investigation. And then just with respect to Michael Wynn, I had no reason not to trust that Michael was giving me information that he had already collected and that I thought that the Attorney General's office already had. So I thought that whatever he gave me was for the purposes of investigating that referral.
Okay. I want you to look. I'll put some hard copies up there for you. It's in
Yes, sir.
evidence now. Exhibit 678.
678.
And it's going to be Bates stamp. Well, do you need the Bates stamp? No. Okay. Thank you. Can you tell us what that is, please?
So this is an email that I sent to Ryan Vassar with this is the same day that I met with Mr. Paxton on 9/4, and when I got back home, I signed the draft contract that they sent me and sent it back, and I asked for an executed copy back. Mr. Vassar had asked me to see if there were any kind of conflicts, so I reached out. I didn't have any clients that had any cases pending where the AG's office was opposing counsel, and I reached out to the State Bar Ethics Hotline and said, "Hey, is this okay? I don't have any cases pending against them," and they said, "It's fine. Congratulations on the job."
All right. I'm trying to look at these subpoenas in terms of what's admitted, and I want you, if you would, to turn to 681. I'm only going to ask you to not put it up because I believe that's one no, that is one that's in evidence. Can you help me out? Look at 681 and identify this for the jury, please.
So this was an email from me to Michael Wynn, and it says sample form grand jury, Google grand jury subpoena.
All right. And then look over to why did you send it to Michael Wynn?
Michael Wynn had initially, so I had never issued a grand jury subpoena before.
Pardon me?
I had never issued a grand jury subpoena before.
Right.
And so I asked Michael, once I put this draft together, if you take a look at it, it's the same information that they had already given me, and make sure that the form here is correct.
And so Mr. Wynn respond to you and tell you it was okay?
He said, form is fine.
And then at the end of the day, what did that help you do?
What did it help me do?
Yes. Did that help you decide how you were going to do the subpoenas and what language you were going to use and everything?
I sent this to him. I mean, I knew he was a federal prosecutor at this point in the past, Harvard educated. I just sent it to him does the form look okay here? So it helped me to know that this was the right way to do it.
All right. Your Honor, I'm looking here. I was having to order up the ones they've objected to. And there are some of these that I very much want to get into evidence. And I don't believe there is a legitimate objection. I'm trying to figure out how to handle this without taking any undue time now. But for instance, if I could, do we have hard copies for the court, Stella? Of these exhibits, do we have any more stacks? Do you have before you 691 without saying anything about what is in context? I want you to identify it for the record and tell us what it is.
Mr. Hardin, you said 691?
Yes. I wrote that down as one you objected to.
I don't have a 6. Oh, I do too. I stand corrected. Thank you.
We had that on the list you objected to, correct?
Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
Well, we're waiting for us to see it. We don't have a copy before we can rule.
Yes, sir.
All right. You see 691, would you, without talking about the internal contents yet, would you describe what that document is?
This was an email from Michael Wynn on September 21st, 2020, with an attached Excel spreadsheet that appears to have individuals' names listed there with various demographic information.
Does it list names, addresses, and identifying data that have been blacked out for purposes of this exhibit? But does it list names, addresses, and personal data of people to be investigated and included on the grand jury subpoena?
Yes, sir.
All right. I don't understand what the objection was to that, Your Honor.
Well, give us, go ahead, I'm sorry.
The objection is hearsay. It's not a list created by Mr. Kamek, but by Mr. Wynn, and it is being offered for the truth of the matter asserted because they're going to...
Your Honor, go ahead. I'm excused if you were talking. No, I thought you were through. Go ahead.
That's okay. It is going to be offered for the truth of the matter asserted because they're going to be arguing that these were the names ultimately where subpoenas were being used on. So objection, hearsay.
There are a series of these, Your Honor, that first of all, not offered for the truth of the matter, only that was provided to them. We are not suggesting that these people should be and were witnesses for the grand jury, should have been a grand jury subpoena. But the more important part is, Article 16 is a conspiracy article that says that General Paxton engaged in conspiracy with others. We are not alleging that they engaged in this conspiracy with Mr. Kamek. We are alleging that he engaged in a conspiracy with Mr. Paul and Mr. Wynn. And any statements that are made in pursuant of that conspiracy would be admissible, whether or not it is hearsay. It's an exception to the hearsay rule. I know I am springing that on the court. You might want a moment to think about it or so, but that's why, A, it's not hearsay, but B, even it it is an act in furtherance of the conspiracy.
They are admissible through the testimony of a co-conspirator, not through Mr. Kamek, who Mr. Hardin admits is not a co-conspirator.
Give us a moment.
Pardon me? Okay.
And just, Judge, Mr. President, while you're considering this, I would, based upon Mr. Hardin's argument for the admissibility of it, there is no suggestion that General Paxton created or participated in the creation or the assimilation of this exhibit.
Okay, give us a moment.
Your Honor, if I may, there's a business records affidavit, Exhibit 547, a business record affidavit for all of Mr. Kamick's files. So the idea of this hearsay goes out the window. It would have to be kept out for some other reason. These are all have been certified. Can we bring, if you'd like, I'll bring up the affidavit for you to look at. 547.
You can't put a business record on something that is, you can't make a co-conspirator statement admissible or whatever through a business records affidavit. You okay on water, Brandon? You all right on water?
As you said, Mr. Hardin, you didn't mean to spring this on the court at the last second, but it is to us at the last second. I think this is a good time for a lunch break.
Sure.
And give us a chance to review all of this.
And just for your edification, Mr. President, I think the majority of these, I think, Rusty, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the ones we're objecting to are very similar to, our objection to these is going to be consistent with the majority of the other ones that you want in, right?
That was going to be my next question, is the objection on all of these
I don't know all of them, but most of them.
Most of them.
Yeah, his objection would cover those, and our response covers all those that were kept out in his records.
Okay.
Thank you.
We may reach out to you during the lunch break. We may not, but we'll come back at 1 p.m. The witness can be excused to 1 p.m. You want to be back at 1? And counsel, can you both come up before you all leave for the lunch break?